A Navy SEAL doesn't scare easily, but that night the snow did something worse than scare him. It went silent. No wind, no birds, just a white forest holding its breath. Then his Belgian Malinois, his K9 partner, walked to the cabin door and knocked. Not once, not twice, 3 times, like a signal, like a warning. When the SEAL opened the door, his K9 didn't bark or run. He grabbed the man's pant leg and dragged him into the whiteout. And there, beneath the pines, a starving Malinois mother was crouched over 2 puppies, shaking so hard her teeth clicked. But it wasn't the cold that froze the SEAL's blood. It was the mark on her collar. Military-grade webbing, torn clean, and a symbol he'd seen before. Then, far off in the trees, an engine cut out. Someone had been watching the whole time. If you're ready to hear what happened next, hit like, share this story, and subscribe to K9 and SEAL Stories right now. The forest looked clean enough to forgive you. That was the lie Winter always told. Snow had packed itself into every seam of the white pines and spruce, smoothing the world until even the angles of the mountains softened into pale silhouettes. Wind moved through the needles with a dry, steady hiss, and the glare off the drifts was so bright it felt like the day was exposing everything you'd tried to keep hidden. Trent Hargrove stood inside his cabin with that same exposed feeling, shoulders square, posture upright out of habit rather than comfort. He was a man in his early 30s with an angular, rugged face and a sharp jawline, clean-shaven, cold blue-gray eyes that seemed to measure rooms the way they used to measure streets. His hair was a modern, neat short undercut, tight faded sides, a short textured top, kept disciplined like the rest of him. He wore the only thing he ever wore anymore, a complete standard-issue green digital camouflage uniform, blouse and trousers properly fitted and fully buttoned, a plain black belt, plain black combat boots, no hat, no gloves, no vest. Nothing to soften him, nothing to decorate him. It wasn't practicality, it was a rule he'd written for himself the day he came home and realized he didn't trust comfort, not to become another kind of surrender. He folded the last of his things into a duffel that had seen too many flights and too many silent goodbyes. Spare socks, a battered notebook with blank pages he never filled, a thermal blanket he'd meant to donate but kept anyway because letting go felt like losing control. He told himself he was leaving for a simple reason. The cabin was too quiet, and quiet gave his memories room to stand up. But the truer reason was uglier. Staying meant believing he could be something other than the man who knew how to disappear. And Trent had built his life on disappearance. Near the wood stove, Vesper lay stretched out as if he owned the warmth. A full-grown male Belgian Malinois, 4 to 5 years old, lean and muscular with a deep fawn-to-mahogany coat and a distinct black facial mask. He looked carved from discipline the same way Trent did. Upright ears, intense dark amber eyes, always alert, always steady. Vesper carried a focused, obedient, mission-ready posture. Even when he was resting, he didn't beg, he didn't fidget, he simply watched, and when he watched Trent, it wasn't the soft, needy gaze of a pet. It was the calm, aligned attention of a partner facing the same direction. That had been the deal between them from the beginning. No theatrics, no noise, just the bond that came from surviving the same kind of weather, whether it fell from the sky or lived under your ribs. Trent zipped the duffel and set it by the door. "We go at first light," he said, though light had been around for hours, bouncing off snow like a spotlight. Vesper didn't move, but one ear rotated, tasting the air. Trent noticed and tried to ignore it. He'd learned to ignore signals, because in the past, signals had led to bodies and smoke. But Vesper didn't ignore anything. It started as a change in the room, subtle as breath. Vesper's head lifted, slow and certain. His nose swept the air once, twice. Then he stood, He crossed the floor without hesitation and stopped at the door. Not whining, not barking, just still. Trent watched him, irritation rising from a place that wasn't anger, so much as fear of being pulled back into responsibility. "No," Trent muttered, more to himself than the dog. Vesper answered by tapping the wood with his paw. 3 measured knocks, like code, like insistence. Trent froze. 3 knocks wasn't a dog's accident. It was a pattern. Vesper knocked again. 1, 2, 3, then turned his head just enough to pin Trent with those amber eyes, a look that carried the blunt message Vesper had always delivered with his body. "Get up. Now." Trent exhaled slowly, feeling that old, tight sensation in his chest, the one that used to come before a door opened into something you couldn't take back. He unlatched the lock. Cold knifed into the cabin immediately, crisp and metallic. Vesper slipped out, paused, and then pivoted back to Trent's leg, catching the fabric of the uniform trousers out gently between his teeth. No tug that would tear, just a firm pull that said this was not optional. Trent didn't like being led. He followed anyway. Outside, the world was loud in its silence. Snow squeaked beneath his boots and the wind slapped thin crystals against his cheeks. The trees stood dense and tall, their trunks dark columns against white ground. The logging trail was half buried, its ruts softened into uneven ridges. Vesper moved ahead with controlled speed. Not frantic, not playful. Purposeful. He stopped sometimes and angled his head, ears pivoting like antennae. Trent's breath fogged in front of him, and for a second he hated the fact that he had no extra layers. Hated how the cold reached for gaps like it knew where to find weakness. He told himself he was only going a few yards. Vesper made that lie impossible. The dog cut off the trail and slipped between 2 spruce trees into a patch of deeper snow where the wind had carved a shallow bowl. Trent pushed through, boots sinking, and the forest opened into a pocket of stillness, protected from the gusts. That's where he saw her. Lyra lay half-curled in a hollow the snow had formed beneath low branches. She was a Belgian Malinois female, 3 to 4 years old. The same fawn mahogany palette as Vesper, but dulled by wet snow and exhaustion. Her black facial mask was sharp, but the skin around her eyes looked tight, stretched thin by hunger and stress. She was built for work, compact strength in the shoulders, long lines in the legs, yet she was gaunt in a way that told a story you didn't need words for. Her ears were up but trembling, one of them dipping slightly, as if even holding them high cost too much. Her amber-brown eyes tracked Trent with a guarded intelligence. Not the wide panic of a stray, but the hard caution of an animal that had learned what hands could do. Between her forelegs, 2 puppies huddled, 6 to 8 weeks old, small bodies shaking, their fawn coats still soft with puppy fluff, their masks only beginning to define. One pup tried to stand and immediately wobbled, front paw skidding. The other barely lifted its head at all, breath coming in faint, wet little pulls. Lyra shifted her weight so her body blocked Trent's approach, spine stiff, lips not curled but ready. She wasn't asking for mercy. She was negotiating. Trent stopped, hands open at his sides, letting the cold burn his fingers because he didn't trust sudden movement. Vesper stepped in front of him, not threatening Lyra, not challenging her, just placing himself as a bridge. The 2 Malinois looked at each other, and something passed between them that Trent couldn't name but understood anyway. Recognition, maybe. Shared language. Vesper turned and moved to the weaker puppy. For a moment, Trent thought he'd made a mistake bringing his dog here, thought Vesper might spook the mother into biting. Instead, Vesper lowered his head with impossible gentleness, took the puppy by the scruff the way a mother would, and lifted. The tiny body went limp in his mouth, not in fear, but in the instinctive surrender of a pup being carried. Vespa climbed the small drift at the edge of the hollow, just a short rise of packed snow, and laid the puppy down nearer Trent where the footing was firmer. Then he stepped sideways and stood, angled protectively, eyes locked on Trent, posture saying, "Take it. Now." Trent's throat tightened, not with sentimentality but with the shock of witnessing a kind of intelligence that didn't ask permission to be holy. He knelt, careful, and slid his hands beneath the pup. The puppy was frighteningly light, ribs like thin sticks under fur, its body cold enough to make his palms ache. It gave a weak, broken sound that barely qualified as a whine. Lyra's gaze snapped to the puppy in Trent's hands, and she tensed, ready to lunge. Trent didn't flinch. "I'm not taking," he said quietly, voice rough from disuse. "I'm helping." His words felt absurd in the open air, swallowed by wind, but his tone held a steadiness he hadn't felt in a long time. He reached into the duffel strap slung across his shoulder. He'd grabbed it without thinking when Vesper pulled him out, and yanked free the folded thermal blanket he'd been packing. He spread it on the snow, then shifted closer, keeping himself low. The stronger puppy wobbled toward the blanket, drawn by movement. Lyra hesitated, then dragged herself forward enough to keep her body between Trent and the pups. Up close, Trent saw the details. A raw, thin rope burn around her neck, angry red against fur, and beneath it, tangled in the hair, a torn strip of technical webbing. Gray-black, frayed, bearing a faint symbol like a bird in mid-flight, not a brand anyone sewed onto a dog for love. More like a tag ripped off in a hurry. Trent's stomach sank with a familiar dread, the kind that came when you realized the world had found you again. He wrapped the blanket around the two puppies first, then eased the weaker one into the fold against the other's small warmth. The stronger pup pressed its nose against its sibling, as if trying to share heat the way it shared breath. Lyra watched every inch of the motion, trembling with effort, but she didn't bite. That was the first surrender, not of obedience, but of choice. As Trent shifted to wrap the blanket around Lyra's shoulders, Vesper abruptly stiffened. His ears snapped forward, and he turned his head toward the trees behind them, as if he'd heard something Trent couldn't. He didn't bark, he didn't growl. He walked back to the cabin trail, stopped and looked over his shoulder, then tapped his paw against the snow in that same measured rhythm. 1, 2, 3. Trent's pulse jumped. 3 knocks again, but out here there was no door, only forest. Vesper's eyes held an urgency that felt almost deliberate, like the dog was counting time. Trent followed the direction of Vespa's stare, and, for half a heartbeat, saw what could have been nothing, a slight shimmer between trunks, a dark shape where the white should have been uninterrupted. Then the wind lifted, snow flashed, and the shimmer vanished. Trent's body reacted before his mind caught up, muscles tightening, senses sharpening, old training waking up like it had never slept. He hated it, the way part of him was relieved. He hated it more that Vesper had been right. Whatever had driven Lyra into this hollow was not simply weather. Something else had been close enough to watch. Trent swallowed the cold and forced himself to move faster, because speed was the only mercy the forest offered. He worked quickly, talking under his breath as if the sound could hold the world together. He wrapped Lyra's shoulders with the edge of the blanket, then slid an arm under her chest, careful of ribs, and coaxed her up. She swayed, legs stiff, then found her balance with stubborn will. The stronger puppy tottered, and Trent scooped it, tucking it against the blanket fold with the weaker one. Lyra tried to follow without being carried, and Trent let her. He'd learned the hard way that dignity mattered to the living, even to animals. Vesper took point, not running but moving with that precise, controlled gait that kept his body ready to pivot. On the way back, Trent kept glancing at the trees, searching for tracks, for movement. The snow would have shown everything, yet the wind was already brushing the surface smooth. erasing evidence with indifferent patience. That was what scared him most. Someone could be near, and the storm would make it look like no one had ever existed. The cabin appeared through the trees like a small, stubborn silhouette. Trent shoved the door open and ushered the dogs inside, the warmth from the stove wrapping around them in a rush. He laid the puppies on a rug near the heat, then guided Lyra to a spot where she could see them. She collapsed with a soft exhale that sounded like defeat and relief braided together. Vesper circled once, then stood between Lyra and Trent, not aggressive, just present, an officer at a checkpoint deciding who belonged. Trent grabbed another blanket, tucked it around Lyra, and then forced himself to breathe slowly, counting the puppy's breaths, with the same focus he'd once used on radio chatter. One pup's chest rose with effort. The other's breaths were so shallow, Trent had to place 2 fingers lightly against its side to confirm it was still there. He found a bowl, poured lukewarm water, and dipped a corner of cloth, touching it to a puppy's mouth. The tiny tongue flicked once, then stopped, too cold, too tired. Trent felt something in him crack, not loudly, not dramatically, but like ice giving way under a step. He had been ready to leave this place and call it healing. Now the cabin held a mother and 2 newborn lives, and the simple fact of them existing in his care made his planned departure feel like betrayal. Vesper refused to lie down. He prowled the porch area, nose low, reading the seams around the door, then returned to the window and stared into the white glare outside. Lyra lifted her head with effort, eyes never leaving her pups. Trent picked up the torn strip of technical webbing he'd pulled from Lyra's fur and held it closer to the stove light. The bird emblem, faint, stylized, looked like a thing designed by someone who wanted to appear harmless. Trent had met too many harmless logos that belonged to ruthless people. He tucked the strip into his pocket, then looked at his duffel by the door and realized he couldn't remember why he thought leaving would fix anything. Fixing had never been his skill. Surviving was. But Vesper had just made survival mean more than one heartbeat. The cabin settled into a tense quiet, punctuated by the stove's soft crackle and the occasional tiny sound from the pups. Trent sat on the floor near them, back against the wall, trying to keep his breathing calm so the dogs wouldn't feed on his nerves. Outside, the wind rose again, whispering through the pines, like a warning told too late. Vesper's head snapped toward the door. He didn't bark. He didn't look at Trent. He simply froze, ears high, body angled toward the sound. Then faint, so faint Trent wondered if memory was playing tricks, came the distant whine of an engine, thin and wavering through the trees. A snowmobile. It drifted closer for a second, then cut out as if whoever rode it knew exactly when to go silent. Trent's stomach tightened. Out here, no one came by accident. Vesper's dark amber eyes met Trent's cold blue-gray ones, aligned in the same direction, the same truth. And for the first time since Trent had decided to run, he understood he might not get to choose the timing anymore. By morning the cabin smelled like smoke, wet fur, and the sharp medicinal sting of melted snow, turning to water on old wood. Trent Hargrove had not slept so much as drifted in shallow pockets, waking each time one of the puppies made a thin, hiccuping sound, or Lyra shifted to tuck her body tighter around them. The mother Malinois stayed curled on the rug near the stove, gaunt but unyielding, her amber-brown eyes tracking every move Trent made with a wary intelligence that felt less like fear and more like calculation. Vesper never fully relaxed. The full-grown male Belgian Malinois held himself with that steady mission-ready posture, even inside the cabin's warmth. Upright ears, intense dark amber eyes, a lean muscular frame built to move fast and stop faster. He would sit, then rise, then sit again, as if the room itself kept changing shape. Trent told himself it was simple. A new mother and 2 pups didn't belong in a half-isolated cabin with no supplies, no antibiotics, no oxygen, and no second chances if the cold settled into little lungs. So he did what he always did when fear tried to paralyze him. He made a plan that fit inside his hands. He warmed water, mixed it with a pinch of sugar and salt, the way he'd once done for heat casualties, and coaxed a few drops into the weaker puppy's mouth with the corner of a cloth. The pup barely responded, a tiny tongue flicking like a spark that might die at any second. That was enough to make Trent's throat tighten in a way he hated. He wasn't built for helpless things. He was built for problems you could solve with motion. He checked Lyra's rope-burned neck, the torn strip of gray-black technical webbing with the bird emblem now tucked into his pocket, and the pup's feet for frostbite. One puppy's front paw was scraped raw, as if it had been dragged over ice or hard gravel. The other's breathing carried a faint wheeze. Too wet, too shallow. Trent didn't give names to the pups yet. Naming felt like promising, and Trent had spent too long believing promises were how you invited the universe to prove you wrong. He loaded them anyway, blankets, towels, a thermos of warm water, and the dogs, into an older pickup he kept for supply runs. Its heater temperamental, but better than nothing. Lyra resisted the truck at first, bracing, muscles trembling, then climbed in when Trent placed the pups first and stepped back, giving her the dignity of choosing. Vesper jumped in last and took the seat closest to the pups, his body angled so he could block them if the vehicle jolted, his gaze fixed forward, aligned with Trent even when Trent's mind was anything but aligned with himself. The road down toward town was a narrow ribbon, carved through white pines. Snow piled high on either side like walls. Trent drove with the same controlled patience he'd once used in hostile alleys. Hands steady, eyes scanning the tree line, the mirrors, the curve ahead. The small logging town appeared in a basin of gray light, a handful of buildings hunched against winter, smoke rising from chimneys, a sawmill's skeleton looming beyond the main road. The veterinary clinic sat near the edge of town, practical and plain, a squat structure with a single bright sign and windows fogged by warmth. Inside, heat hit Trent like a memory, overwhelming at first, then almost painful, once he realized how cold he'd been. Dr. Jody Klein looked up from behind the counter as the bell jingled. She was in her late 30s, medium height with a wiry, no-nonsense build that came from long hours on her feet. Not a gym. Her skin was pale from winter and indoor lights, her face a sharp-boned with alert eyes the color of dark tea that didn't miss details. Brown hair, streaked with a few premature silvers, was pulled into a low, tight ponytail, the kind of hairstyle worn by someone who couldn't afford to have loose strands grabbed by a panicked animal. She wore dark scrubs under a charcoal clinic jacket and shoes with thick, non-slip soles. An ID badge clipped at her chest bounced once as she stood. Her expression softened for half a second when she saw the puppies, then hardened into focused competence. "You look like you slept in your uniform," she said, not unkindly, just stating what was true. Trent didn't correct her with the deeper truth, that he hadn't stopped wearing it. "They needed heat," he replied. "And help." Jody moved fast, hands gentle but efficient, guiding Lyra into an exam room with the calm authority of someone who'd been bitten and kept going anyway. Lyra's body tensed when the door closed. Vesper stepped between Lyra and Jody without a sound, not aggressive, simply asserting space. Trent watched that, felt a flicker of gratitude and the old sting of shame at how much he relied on a dog to do what his own body refused to do. Trust. Jody examined Lyra first, running careful fingers along the rope-burned neck and the lean ribs. "She's not feral," Jody murmured more to herself than to Trent. "This is working dog posture. See how she holds her weight? And this?" She parted fur at Lyra's shoulder, and revealed a small, healed puncture scar, neat and intentional. That's not a random injury. Her eyes sharpened as she checked Lyra's teeth, then her paws. These nails are trimmed like someone maintained her. Trent swallowed. The idea of Lyra being maintained like equipment made something cold slide down his spine. Jody moved to the puppies, lifting each with a practiced cradle. The scraped paw earned a low hum of concern. The wheezing pup made her frown. Cold stress, maybe mild aspiration, maybe the start of pneumonia if we're unlucky, she said. But they're alive. That's the win we start with. Lyra hovered over the pups, trembling, and Jody let her, speaking softly in a tone meant for animals and exhausted humans alike. "You did your job," she told the dog, as if acknowledging a soldier. Lyra's eyes flicked to Trent, then back to her pups, as if she didn't believe praise from anyone who wasn't feeding them. As Jody prepared a warm pad and a small nebulizer setup, she noticed something at the edge of one puppy's ear. A dot, no larger than a grain of pepper, easy to dismiss as dirt. She leaned closer, brows drawing together. "Hold this light," she said, handing Trent a small pen light. Trent angled it as instructed. Jody's fingers were steady as she brushed the fur aside. "This isn't mud," she said quietly. She went to a drawer and pulled out a compact UV lamp, standard clinic gear for certain stains and skin checks, then clicked it on. Violet light spilled over the puppy's ear like a bruise made of illumination. The dot came alive. What had looked like nothing now resolved into a micro-fine pattern. A tiny cluster of marks arranged with the precision of print rather than the randomness of grime. Microdot. Micro-tattoo. Not a chip. No bulge under skin. No radio frequency to scan. Just a hidden label meant to be seen only by someone who knew to look. Trent felt his jaw tighten. "That's intentional," he said. Jody's mouth flattened. "Yes." She checked the second puppy and found a similar mark, slightly different arrangement. "2 pups, 2 patterns," she whispered. "That's not a breeder's mark." She looked at Lyra again, eyes narrowing. "And your mother here has that injection scar and rope burns. Someone handled this family like cargo, then lost control of it." Trent stared at the violet glow, his mind sliding back into a mindset he'd fought to bury. Threat assessment, chain of custody, who benefits? Jody exhaled and straightened. "I have to log them," she said, voice careful. "By law. Unknown origin, possible exposure. It's not optional." Trent felt heat flare in his chest. "Logging them means someone can come claim them." Jody met his eyes without blinking. "Logging them means I can keep them here under medical necessity and document the injuries. That can protect them too, if the right people see it." Trent almost laughed at the phrase "right people," because he'd learned the world didn't always produce those on demand. Still, he nodded once. Jody started a file, her typing crisp, her tone clinical, and Trent watched how she used professionalism like a shield. She was the kind of woman who didn't waste bravery on speeches. She used it quietly, in the decision to do the hard thing correctly, even when it painted a target on her back. The clinic's front bell chimed again, and the air shifted. Sheriff Nolan Braddock stepped in as if he'd been there all along. He was in his mid-50s, tall with a broad chest that suggested he'd once been built for strength and now maintained it out of habit and reputation. His face was square, the kind that photographed well for community flyers, salt and pepper hair cut short, a calm smile practiced into place. Yet his eyes were colder than his expression, pale and measuring. He wore a beige-brown sheriff's uniform with a dark duty belt and black boots polished enough to reflect the clinic's overhead lights. He looked around slowly, taking inventory of the room the way Trent did, except Braddock made it seem like friendliness. "Doc," he said, voice smooth. "Heard you had a situation." Jody's shoulders tightened by a fraction, but her voice stayed even. Morning, Sheriff. We've got a mother and 2 pups with cold exposure. Medical case. Braddock's gaze slid past her to the puppies, lingering a moment too long. Cute little things, he said, stepping closer. Vesper moved without sound, placing his body between Braddock and the pups, head level, ears forward, not barking, not posturing, just a wall of muscle and will. Braddock paused, smile still there, but his eyes narrowed. Still running war dogs up in the hills, huh? He asked Trent, as if they were old acquaintances. Trent didn't answer the familiarity. He noticed instead the sheriff's gloves. Dark leather, clean, yet carrying a faint scent that hit Trent's trained senses like a warning flare. Chemical sweetness under oil, the clinical edge of sedative mixed with machine grease, as if the man had been handling veterinary drugs somewhere he shouldn't. Braddock leaned slightly, trying to see around Vesper. "What'd you find them on?" he asked, too specific, too casual. "If these are someone's working animals, we need to make sure nobody's out searching and getting themselves killed." Jody cut in. "I'm documenting injuries. They stay here until I clear them medically." Braddock's smile thinned. "Of course, Doc. Just doing my job." Trent met Braddock's eyes and felt that old internal click, recognition of a man who knew how to hide intent behind procedure. Braddock's gaze dropped briefly to the UV lamp on the counter, still faintly glowing. For the smallest instant, something flickered across his face. Interest sharpened into certainty. Then the smile returned, careful as a mask. Trent's blood went colder than the snow outside. Whatever those microdots meant, this sheriff had seen them before. Jody kept her hands moving, adjusting the nebulizer for the wheezing pup, speaking in short instructions that gave her authority back. "Sheriff, I'll file the report, but these animals are in my care." Braddock's voice stayed light. "No argument. Just let me know if you find a tag, a name, anything. Folks panic when they lose animals out here." Trent could hear the double meaning. Braddock took one more step, and Vesper's lips lifted just enough to show the edge of teeth. Not a snarl, a boundary. Lyra rose slightly from her crouch, placing herself closer to her pups, eyes locked on Braddock with a hard, maternal hatred that made her exhaustion look like a temporary condition. Braddock raised his hands in a theatrical gesture of peace and backed away. "All right," he said, chuckling softly. "No need for drama." He nodded at Trent. "You're doing a good thing, son. Town appreciates that." Then he left, boots tapping with a measured confidence that made Trent want to follow him, just to confirm which way he turned. Instead, Trent stayed still, because stillness kept panic from spilling out. Jody waited until the bell stopped moving before she spoke again. "He came fast," she said quietly. "Too fast for a normal report." Trent's jaw worked once. "He's not here for community safety." Jody looked at the puppies, then at Lyra's scars, and her expression tightened with something close to anger. "No," she agreed, "and he's here because someone wants them back." She lowered her voice. "I can keep them for observation. But if you feel like you're being watched, don't be heroic. Be smart." Trent stared at the pups, the tiny rise and fall of their chests, and felt a pressure behind his eyes he refused to name as grief. "Smart is why I came down here," he said. "And Smart says I'm not leaving them where he can walk in with paperwork." Jody's mouth opened as if to argue. Then she looked at Lyra, at Vesper, at the way the mother's body stayed angled to protect her pups, and she closed it. "Give me 10 minutes, she said instead. "I'll prep what you need. Saline, antibiotics I can spare, a warming pack. But understand something. Taking sick pups back into the hills is risky." Trent nodded. "Leaving them here is worse." He loaded the dogs back into the truck with careful choreography. Pups first, bundled deep in blankets with a warm gel pack wrapped in cloth. Lyra next, helped gently, but allowed to step in on her own. Vesper last, jumping in and immediately turning to face the clinic door, as if he expected it to open again. Jody stood in the doorway, jacket pulled tight against the cold, watching with the tense posture of someone who'd just realized her quiet town had teeth. She handed Trent a small bag of supplies and a folded paper with her number written in heavy ink. "If that pup's breathing worsens, you come back," she said. "No matter what." Trent took the paper like it weighed something. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in the only way he knew, by planning not to waste what she'd risked. He drove out of the parking lot slowly, forcing normalcy into his hands on the wheel. Only when he was 2 blocks away did he let his eyes flick to the mirrors. He didn't see a tail. That didn't mean he didn't have one. The road toward the forest rose and narrowed, the town fading into a gray smudge behind him. When he stopped briefly at the edge of the clinic lot to adjust the blankets around the pups, he noticed the snow by the curb. Fresh tire marks cut through it. Deep, aggressive tread, not the worn patterns most locals left after months of winter driving. The tracks were clean-edged, new, and they hadn't been there when he'd arrived. Trent stared at them until his breath steadied. Somebody had come in hard and recently, then left without going inside. A watcher, a courier, or a cage waiting to close. He got back behind the wheel, felt Vesper's focused gaze on the back of his neck, and drove toward the white pines with a single bitter thought he couldn't shake. He hadn't brought trouble to town. Trouble had been waiting for him to hold the right thing in his hands. The drive back into the hills felt longer than it should have, as if the forest had stretched itself to keep Trent Hargrove away from whatever waited in its cold center. Snow moved sideways in thin sheets, the beginning of a whiteout that didn't roar like a blizzard but swallowed sound with a patient, suffocating softness. The pines rose on either side of the road like dark spears, their branches heavy, their needles combing the wind into a constant hush. In the rearview mirror, the town's lights had vanished quickly, leaving only gray and white and the faint reflection of Trent's own eyes. Cold blue-gray, steady on the surface, frantic underneath if he let himself feel it. He kept both hands on the wheel, posture upright, disciplined athletic build held tight in his uniform, as if the fabric could keep his thoughts from spilling out. He told himself the decision was tactical, not emotional. The clinic was too exposed, the sheriff too interested the pups too fragile to be turned into paperwork. Yet the more honest truth pressed against his ribs. He couldn't stand the idea of those 2 tiny lives being claimed by the wrong hands while he watched. That kind of helplessness had almost killed him once. He didn't survive all those years just to relearn it now. In the back seat, the puppies were bundled so deep in blankets they were mostly a shape of breathing. Lyra lay curled around them, the Belgian Malinois mother still gaunt, her deep fawn to mahogany coat damp where snow had melted and refrozen, her black facial mask making her expression look harsher than it was. She was exhausted but not soft. Her ears twitched at every shift in the truck's suspension, and her amber-brown eyes never fully closed. Vesper, the full-grown male Malinois, stayed pressed close to them, lean muscles coiled, upright ears tracking the world even through glass. He didn't pant. He didn't whine. He simply watched the direction Trent drove, as if the road itself were an order they had to obey. When the cabin finally appeared between trees, wooden shoulders hunched under snow, a small rectangle of shelter in a white sea, Trent felt a brief, bitter relief. Home meant control. Control meant survival. Then he parked, and the relief died, because the yard looked wrong. Not obviously wrong. Wrong the way a room looks when something has been moved 2 inches and your body notices before your mind does. He didn't step straight out. He sat, listening. Whiteout made the world deceptively calm. Sound dampened until even the truck's cooling engine seemed distant. Trent's gaze traveled over the snow berms and the woodpile, and the land where the porch met the drift. Nothing moved, but Vesper lifted his head and stared at the porch steps with a stillness that felt like warning. Trent got out anyway, leaving the door open so he could hear if the dogs shifted behind him. His boots crunched softly. He kept his shoulders loose, hands down, and yet every part of him was ready to strike, because that was what his body did when the world went quiet. Inside, the cabin's heat wrapped around them like a promise. Trent carried the pups in first, set them near the stove on fresh towels. Lyra followed, limping slightly, but refusing help, pride stubborn as bone. Vesper came last and immediately moved to the window, exactly the same spot he'd chosen the night before, standing like a statue cut from mahogany and shadow. Black mask turned toward the forest, eyes intense, steady, mission-ready. Trent fed the stove, then mixed more electrolyte water the way Jody had shown him, the rag in his hands, shaking just slightly when he wasn't paying attention. He hated that shake. It reminded him he was human. Humans broke. Dogs didn't, not in the ways that mattered. Lyra shifted closer to her pups, body curved around them. The scraped paw puppy made a small sound and tried to crawl. Lyra nudged it back with a firm maternal nose, then pressed her chin to its back as if to lend it weight and warmth. The wheezing puppy's breaths were quieter now after the clinic's quick treatment, but still wet enough to make Trent flinch. He leaned close, counting rises and falls the way he used to count heartbeats under his palm in places where medevac didn't come. Vesper's tail moved once, barely a motion, then stilled. His ears twitched. When the phone finally rang, it sounded too loud in the cabin's hush. Trent answered on the second ring. "Doc," he said before she spoke, as if naming her could steady him. Dr. Jody Klein's voice came through, crackled but clear. "How's the noisy one breathing?" she asked, tone brisk, the kind of briskness that kept fear from turning into drama. Trent described the wheeze. Jody listened, then said, "Good. Keep the air warm. Keep them upright a bit if they cough. And, Trent, about those microdots." He could hear her hesitate, which meant she was choosing words that wouldn't regret being spoken. "I have a friend who can read patterns and formats without turning it into a spy movie." An hour later, headlights cut through the snow curtain and rolled into Trent's yard. Trent watched from the window with Vesper, both of them still. The vehicle was an older station wagon, practical, not flashy. When the driver stepped out, he moved like someone who'd learned to keep his balance on ice without thinking about it. Noah Brandt was in his early 40s, lean and slightly stooped at the shoulders as if he carried invisible weight. His face was narrow with tired lines that didn't belong to his age, dark stubble shadowing his jaw, more neglect than style. Hair the color of wet ash lay close to his scalp under a knit beanie, and his eyes were sharp behind thin-framed glasses, the kind of sharpness that came from staring at screens too long, and still noticing the smallest inconsistencies. He wore a charcoal technical parka, zipped to his chin, dark jeans and boots with salt stains at the seams. A black messenger bag hung across his chest, heavy with the careful clunk of equipment. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who'd rather be invisible, and therefore had learned to see everything. Jody followed him in her clinic jacket, cheeks pink from cold, ponytail damp with snowmelt. She greeted Trent with a brisk nod that carried both professionalism and concern. "We're keeping this simple," she said. "Noah reads formats. I treat animals. You keep everyone breathing." Trent stepped aside, letting them in. He saw Noah's eyes flick to Vesper, then to Lyra, then to the pups. The man's expression softened for half a second, the way a certain kind of loneliness recognizes itself in anything that has fought to stay alive. Noah sat up on the kitchen table like he'd done it 100 times in worse places. He pulled out a small macro lens attachment, a compact light panel, a ruler, and a phone mount. Not hacking tools, just documentation tools. "I'm not decrypting anything," he said quietly, as if he could read Trent's suspicion. His voice was low and calm, with the flat honesty of someone who'd been blamed for things he didn't do. "I'm looking at how it's printed. Format tells you intent." Jody held one pup gently while Noah photographed the earmark under a UV penlight. Under magnification, the dot pattern resolved into tiny clustered glyphs, arranged with machine precision. Noah's mouth tightened. "Microdot printing," he murmured, "but not random. That spacing is deliberate, like segments." He took another shot, then compared it to the second pup's mark. Different arrangement, same structure. That suggests 2 pieces of one system. He tapped the ruler lightly against the table, thinking, "It's like splitting a passcode into parts, so no single part is useful by itself." Trent felt his stomach twist. "So, someone marked them on purpose." Noah nodded once. "And whoever did it expected someone else to know where to look." Jody glanced at Lyra. "Does she have one?" Noah asked. Trent shook his head. "Not that I saw." Lyra's rope-burn neck and injection scar were visible signs of handling, but no microdot. Noah stared at the torn strip of technical webbing Trent placed on the table. The bird emblem. Faint but unmistakable. "That might be the key," Noah said. "Sometimes you mark the cargo and tag the handler." He stopped himself, eyes flicking to the pups, then softened his tone. "Sometimes you tag the rote." Outside, the whiteout thickened. The window became a gray smear. Trent felt the cabin shrink around them, every board holding its breath. He listened for engines, for boots, for anything. Vesper's ears rotated, then stopped. His body leaned forward a fraction, muscles tightening. Trent followed his gaze to the porch. Still nothing, yet the sense of being watched pressed against Trent's skin. He tried to focus on the practical. He knelt by Lyra, offering her water. She drank in small, controlled laps, never taking her eyes off the pups. Her temperament was all guard and calculation, a mother who didn't believe generosity came without strings. When Trent reached to check the pup's scraped paw, Lyra's lips curled just slightly. Not biting, just warning. Trent withdrew and spoke softly. "I get it," he said. "I don't trust me either." Lyra's ears flicked, and for the first time her gaze held on his face longer than a second, as if measuring whether he meant that. Cole Dunning called just after dusk, though dusk wasn't darkness so much as the sky turning the color of bruised steel. Cole's voice was loud and hurried, the voice of a man who fixed machines because machines were honest. Cole was mid-30s, broad-shouldered with a thick neck and hands that always looked permanently stained by oil. He ran the only snowmobile shop worth a damn in the little logging town, and everyone knew he'd hear rumors before the sheriff did, because people talked to the guy who kept their engines alive. "Trent," Cole said, skipping greeting. "I'm not trying to spook you, but there's a crew in town that ain't from here. They rented the fuel shed by the old mill. Brought in 2 sleds I've never seen. High output, long range, the kind you don't need unless you're running trails fast. They asked about the north logging cut. Asked about your ridge." Trent's grip tightened on the phone. "Who are they?" Cole exhaled. "They didn't say. Didn't talk like locals. Too tight. Too trained. And one of them paid cash like he didn't want his name anywhere." Trent glanced at Vesper. The dog was still at the window, statue still. "Thanks," Trent said. "Keep your head down." Cole swallowed. "You too." A sound tapped at the cabin. Not a knock at the door, not a branch scraping, a soft, deliberate tick against glass. Trent went still. Jody's eyes lifted. Noah stopped mid-scroll on his phone. Vesper didn't bark. He didn't even growl. He walked to the window with slow certainty and stared at one exact point near the lower pane. Trent followed, heart pounding, and saw it, a tiny red glint on the snow just beyond the porch, like the faint ember of a cigarette, except it didn't flicker. It held steady. Then it moved, sliding a few inches across the drift as if pulled by a fishing line. Trent's mind snapped through possibilities. Camera lure, laser, a test. Vesper raised one paw and placed it against the window, pressing gently, then lowered his head and exhaled once, fogging the glass in a single slow breath. The fog formed a pale circle around the glint outside, like a halo around a warning. Lyra rose behind them, silent, and the pups made a tiny synchronized sound, 2 breaths hitching at once, as if their bodies sensed what their eyes couldn't. Trent felt a sudden, unsettling certainty. Whoever was out there wasn't stumbling through the storm. They were methodical. They were communicating. And they wanted Trent to know they were close enough to touch the cabin without leaving a sound. Trent forced himself to move. He turned off the main lamp, leaving only the stove's glow. Shadows deepened. Jody whispered, "Do you have a weapon?" Trent shook his head without thinking, then realized how ridiculous that sounded, and hated himself for the honesty of it. "No," he said, "not here." Noah's jaw flexed. "Then we don't play hero," Noah murmured. "We play smart." Jody nodded. "We keep the pups warm, and we stay quiet." Lyra's body angled between the window and her pups, as if her bones remembered cages and handlers. Vespa shifted slightly to stand in front of Trent, not to protect him like a pet, but to align him like a teammate, the way he always had. Trent grabbed his flashlight and moved to the back door, careful not to silhouette himself. He peered out through the narrow crack. Snow swirled softly. The world beyond was blank, erased. He stepped onto the back porch anyway, boots sinking, breath sharp in his throat. He scanned the tree line. Nothing. No tracks near the steps, only smooth drift. That was the most terrifying part. Either no one had been there, which meant his nerves were lying to him, or someone had been there and had managed to leave nothing, which meant his nerves were finally telling the truth. He went to the woodpile where the snow drifted in a ridge and felt with gloved fingers along the top edge of a log. His fingertip brushed metal. He pulled it free. A hollow plastic cylinder, small, pale, unmistakable. A spent dart casing. Not fired into anyone. Placed. A message in the simplest language of threat. We can take them, and we can do it quietly. Trent returned inside with the casing hidden in his fist. He set it on the table without a word. Jody stared at it, face going hard. Noah exhaled once, like he'd been holding his breath for years and had just discovered he needed more air. Lyra whined low, barely audible, then nudged her pups closer. Vesper's ears twitched as he resumed his post by the window, a silent sentinel. Trent looked at the tiny puppies, their bodies rising and falling in fragile rhythm, and felt something settle in his chest that wasn't fear anymore. It was resolve, sharp as cold. He had tried to leave. The forest had answered by putting a family at his door and a threat at his window. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to let him walk away clean. And if he couldn't walk away clean, then he would stand where he was and make sure the ones who couldn't defend themselves didn't pay the price alone. The next morning arrived without sunrise. In the high country, winter didn't announce itself with color. It simply replaced darkness with a thinner shade of gray and made the snow glare harder, like the world had decided to watch. Trent Hargrove sat at the kitchen table while the cabin warmed, his back straight against the chair as if posture could keep his thoughts from collapsing. He hadn't slept. Not truly. Every time the stove popped, every time a gust pressed against the walls, his mind reached for the same conclusion. They were close, and they were patient. Across the room, Lyra lay curled around her 2 puppies, gaunt but steadier than the day before. her black facial mask sharpening the severity of her expression. The pups were still fragile, but their breaths were more regular, the scraped paw no longer trembling with the constant shock of cold. Vesper stood near the window, lean muscles set, upright ears rotating in small, constant adjustments. When Trent glanced at him, the dog's intense, dark amber eyes met his. Calm, focused, aligned. Like Vesper had already accepted the mission, Trent was still resisting. Noah Brandt worked with the quiet intensity of someone who respected how little time they had. He'd set his phone on a stand and laid out printed macro shots of the microdots like tiny maps. In the cold morning light, his glasses caught pale reflections, making his sharp, tired eyes look even more severe. He compared the two pup marks side by side, then pulled out a small notepad and wrote numbers in tight, precise blocks. "It's not a full coordinate on either pup," he said, voice low. His stubble darkened his jaw, emphasizing the narrow angles of his face. "It's a split string. Think of it like two halves of a root token." He tapped the paper with his pen. "You need both to reconstruct the reference." Trent's jaw tightened. "So, if someone grabs one pup, then you lose leverage," Noah finished, not looking up. "And whoever wants them still has a reason to keep hunting." Jody Klein stood behind him, arms crossed over her clinic jacket, hair pulled tight, her dark tea-colored eyes scanning the images the way she scanned injuries. "And Lyra?" she asked. Noah nodded toward the torn strip of technical webbing with the bird emblem. "That's likely the parent identifier or the handler tag. It doesn't carry the same data, but it ties the pups to a system." He paused, then added, "Which means whoever set this up isn't improvising. They're running a procedure." Trent didn't like the word procedure. Procedures got people hurt while everyone claimed it was necessary. He looked from the paper to the dogs and felt the weight of the decision settle in his gut. Staying here meant being found, being pinned, being forced into a choice where the pups paid the price for his hesitation. Leaving meant dragging sick animals into the forest, into whiteout, onto trails where he could be boxed in. Either way, danger was no longer optional. Trent reached into his pocket and touched the frayed webbing strip. The bird emblem felt like a thorn. "Where does it point?" he asked. Noah slid the notepad across the table. "Once you combine the two halves, you get a reference that matches a grid style used in county infrastructure mapping," he said. "Old projects, drainage, culverts, service access. There's a match near an old construction runoff drain beneath a logging road. Route 12 spur, the kind of place people avoid because it's half-buried, unstable, and no one has a reason to be there." Jody's mouth tightened. "Except someone who wants to stash something." Noah nodded. "Or move something quietly." Trent stood, decision made with the same rigid efficiency he used to rely on before emotions complicated everything. "We leave now," he said. He didn't explain the logic because he didn't trust himself to speak without showing fear. He moved through the cabin with deliberate speed, packing blankets, water, the clinic supplies Jody had brought, and the little essentials that kept a body alive. Noah stuffed his macro kit into his messenger bag, careful with his equipment like it was the only thing that ever listened to him. Jody checked the pups one last time, pressing a stethoscope to the wheezing pup's side, listening with a frown that said she didn't like the sound, but could accept it for a short trip. Lyra watched every movement, protective, suspicious, yet she didn't bolt. She had learned too much about running without a plan. Vesper remained near Trent, pacing only when Trent did, a shadow with teeth. Cole Dunning arrived 10 minutes later, on a snowmobile that looked like it had lived its life on punishment trails. Cole was broad-shouldered and stocky, with a thick beard that turned frosty at the edges as soon as he stepped into the cold. His face was ruddy from windburn and years of fighting engines in winter. He wore a battered work jacket and insulated bib pants stained with grease. A man who carried the smell of fuel and effort like a second skin. His eyes darted nervously toward the tree line. "I shouldn't be here," he said bluntly, but he still handed Trent a spare fuel can and a set of keys. "You take my sled. It's faster than your trucks on these cuts. And don't take the main road. Braddock's already got a deputy, out by the switchback." Trent looked at him. "How do you know?" Cole's jaw flexed. "Because a guy asked me yesterday if I could tune 2 machines for high output and told me not to write anything down. Folks like that don't come here for sightseeing." Cole's gaze flicked to the pups. "You're carrying trouble, man." Trent's voice went quiet. "Trouble found us." Cole swallowed and nodded once, like he understood more than he wanted to. They moved out in a tight, controlled caravan. Cole led briefly to get them onto a back spur, then peeled off with a warning gesture and a final look that carried both fear and respect. Trent drove the snowmobile, posture rigid, eyes scanning the white corridors between trees. Noah rode behind him, gripping the seat with gloved hands, his shoulders hunched against cold. Jody followed on a second sled she'd borrowed from Cole's shop, her body leaning into turns with surprising confidence. Lyra and the pups were bundled in a secured carrier strapped behind Jody, insulated and layered. Vesper ran alongside at first, then hopped onto Trent's sled platform for short bursts when the snow deepened, ears forward, eyes fixed ahead. The forest swallowed their engine noise quickly, turning it into a distant hum that felt too small for the risk. They were 2 miles from the cabin when the first sign appeared. A tree down across the logging cut, freshly cut, not fallen. The trunk lay too straight, blocking the narrow road like a gate. Trent killed the engine and listened. Snow fell softly, the kind that made silence feel thicker. Vesper jumped down, nose low, scanning. He didn't bark. He didn't approach the log head-on. He circled wide, sniffing the snowbank where the trunk met the drift. Trent's skin prickled. A trap didn't need a gun to work. It just needed a pause. Noah leaned close, breath fogging. "We can go around," he whispered. Trent's eyes moved to the trees. Tight, dense, deep snow. Going around meant slowing. Slowing meant being pinned. 2 figures stepped from behind the trunks as if they had been carved from the snowfall. They wore reflective work vests and hard hats, but their movements were wrong for laborers. Too balanced, too quiet, too aware of angles. One was tall and narrow with a hood pulled tight under his helmet. The other shorter, heavier in the shoulders. Their faces were half covered by scarves, only eyes visible, flat, unemotional, watching like they were counting. Neither held a rifle. That was the first lie. The tall one's hand lifted slightly, and Trent saw the tube, small, dark, an air-powered launcher sized for darts. "Easy," the man called, voice muffled. "We're just here to retrieve property." Trent's breath went cold. Property. He felt Noah tense behind him, and Jody's sled engine rev quietly as she prepared to bolt. Lyra's head rose in the carrier, ears twitching, and the pups made tiny noises as if sensing the air tighten. The shorter man moved sideways, trying to get a view of Jody's sled. Vesper's posture changed instantly, shoulders lowering, muscles tightening, eyes narrowing into a single line of focus. He caught the faint, sweet chemical scent on the wind and reacted before Trent could. Vesper launched, fast and silent, cutting across the snow at an angle that wasn't instinct but calculation. The tall man raised the launcher. The dart fired with a soft puff. Vesper twisted mid-run and the dart buried harmlessly in snow. Before the tall man could reload, Vesper slammed into his legs, not biting, just hitting with enough force to throw him off balance. The man went down hard, launcher skidding. Trent didn't waste the moment. He gunned the snowmobile forward, veering off the cut and down a sloped bank where the snow had drifted deep. The sled fishtailed and Noah nearly flew, but Trent leaned hard, using the machine's weight like he'd used his body on ice. Controlled fall, controlled recovery. Jody followed, engine screaming, her sled dropping into the same slope, carrier bouncing but strapped tight. Lyra braced her body around the pups, absorbing shocks like a shield. They slid into a shallow ravine of powder and scattered saplings. The men above shouted. Short, clipped commands that sounded like training, not panic. A second dart hissed past. Trent ducked instinctively, heart hammering, and forced the sled through the ravine's narrow bend where trees closed in and sightlines died. Vesper reappeared behind them, sprinting with relentless drive, a streak of mahogany against white. A small red line marked his shoulder, where something had scraped him, maybe the launcher's edge, maybe a branch. But he didn't slow. He reached Trent's sled and jumped aboard in one fluid motion, standing braced, facing backward now, eyes locked on the slope they'd escaped. As the ravine widened into a frozen clearing, Vesper abruptly shifted his weight and let out a single, sharp exhale, a sound so controlled it was almost silent. Then he did something that made Trent's stomach drop. Vesper turned his head and looked directly at the carrier behind Jody's sled. Not at Lyra, not at the pups, but at the straps. He barked once, one hard, precise bark, and then snapped his jaws at empty air, like he was warning of a threat Trent couldn't see. Trent's eyes followed, and he spotted it. A thin line trailing from the carrier, nearly invisible against snow, tugging and twitching like a spider thread. A tether. Someone had managed to hook a line onto the carrier in the chaos. If they kept running without noticing, the line would lead the hunters straight to them, a silent breadcrumb through whiteout. Trent's pulse surged with sick admiration. That wasn't a random trick. That was someone trained to retrieve without leaving noise. He leaned over, knifeless, gloved fingers fumbling, and yanked the line free until it snapped, the severed end whipping back into snow. Vesper's eyes met Trent's for half a second. No triumph, just certainty. The dog had saved them from being tracked like prey, and he had done it with nothing but instinct and attention. Trent felt a hot sting behind his eyes he refused to indulge. Instead, he nodded once, a wordless thank you spoken in the only language Vesper respected. Action. They didn't stop until the trees thickened again, and the ravine spilled them behind a stand of old pines, where the wind didn't cut as hard. There, half buried under drift and timber scraps, sat an abandoned logging shed. Lean-to walls, warped planks, a roof bowed under snow. Trent killed the engine and listened. No pursuit sounds reached them, but that didn't mean they weren't being flanked. He waved Jody and Noah inside the shed, then crouched with Vesper, checking the dog's shoulder. The cut was shallow, a red seam against fur. Trent pressed a cloth to it. Vesper didn't flinch. His eyes remained fixed outward, as if pain was irrelevant until the pups were safe. Inside the shed, Jody knelt by the carrier, checking the pups' breaths, rubbing their chests gently. Her face was tight with controlled fear, but her hands stayed steady because that was her version of bravery. Noah sat against the wall, pulling out his phone and the Microdot photos like a lifeline, his mind anchoring to patterns to avoid drowning in panic. Lyra stayed crouched, body curved around the pups, her gaze shifting between Jody and the entrance, ready to fight if anyone came through. Trent stood at the shed's broken window, scanning the white lanes between trunks. He realized his plan had already changed. This wasn't a simple run to a radio tower or an old station. This was being herded. The people who wanted Lyra and the pups weren't amateurs, and they weren't going to stop at the first failure. When Trent's phone buzzed with a local alert, he felt more dread than surprise. He opened it and saw the sheriff department notice. An advisory for residents to report a suspicious male with an aggressive K9 and unregistered animals. warning that the dogs could be dangerous and the man might be armed. Trent stared at the screen until the words blurred. It was legal pressure disguised as safety, designed to make every civilian eye a surveillance camera. Jody looked over his shoulder, lips pressing into a thin line. "He's making you the story," she said softly. Noah's voice was flat, so nobody asks why a mother dog has rope burns and microdots. Trent turned the phone off. He could feel the old anger rising, familiar and lethal, the kind that used to keep him alive and also kept him alone. He looked down at Lyra, at the way she curled around her pups as if she could become a wall, and at Vesper, blood on his shoulder, still standing guard with that steady, obedient focus. Trent had tried to leave this forest behind. Now the forest was forcing him to choose what kind of man he would be inside it. He didn't speak the decision out loud. He simply checked the straps, adjusted the blankets, and nodded toward the deeper trees. "We move again," he said, voice low, controlled. "No main roads, no towns, no eyes." Vesper's ears flicked forward, aligned. Lyra rose, shaky but determined, and pressed her nose briefly to one pup's head before letting Jody secure the carrier. Noah swallowed, shouldered his bag, and followed without argument. Outside, snow kept falling, soft, endless, covering their tracks even as it revealed them. And somewhere beyond the white trunks, the men in vests would be regrouping, calm, methodical, confident they could retrieve what they called property. Trent stared into the forest and felt his resolve harden into something colder than fear. Let them come, he thought, but they won't take them quietly again. They moved before the sky had decided what kind of day it wanted to be. The forest was a hard white maze, and every hour the snow rewrote the world, covering tracks, erasing mistakes, hiding truths under a clean surface that looked like mercy. Trent Hargrove led the way with the same upright, controlled posture that had carried him through other kinds of white silence. The green digital camouflage of his uniform, an ugly splash of human intent against the snow. His cold blue-gray eyes didn't drift. They scanned. His jaw stayed set, clean-shaven face, rigid with the quiet pressure of responsibility he'd tried to outrun. Behind him, Jody kept the carrier secured against her sled, shoulders tight with fatigue and stubbornness. Noah rode close, messenger bag strapped to his chest, glasses fogging at the edges each time he exhaled. Lyra moved on foot when she could, a gaunt Belgian Malinois mother with a deep fawn-to-mahogany coat, dulled by snow and hunger, black facial mask sharp as a warning. She should have been collapsing, but something in her kept pulling forward, an instinct, deeper than pain. Vesper paced beside Trent like a shadow, full-grown male Malinois, lean and muscular, ears upright, dark amber eyes focused, his mission-ready posture unchanged, even with a shallow cut on his shoulder that had dried into a thin red line. Noah had the coordinates written twice, on paper and in his phone, because he didn't trust batteries, and he didn't trust luck. "It lines up with an old drainage access," he'd said earlier, voice flat. "County project, the kind of thing that never makes it into tourist maps." Trent didn't ask why someone would choose a drainage access, unless they wanted to be unseen. He already knew. They followed the logging spur until the trees thinned into a shallow cut, where wind had sculpted the drifts into sharp ridges. The coordinates were near a bend where the road dipped and the snow piled deeper, as if the earth itself wanted to hide whatever lay beneath. Lyra reached the spot first. That was what hit Trent. How the mother dog, weak as she was, changed the moment the terrain shifted. Her gait tightened. Her head lifted. She stopped and looked not at Trent but at the snowbank, then took 3 measured steps to the left, nostrils flaring, ears twitching. She pawed once, then twice, scraping snow aside with a ferocity that didn't match her exhaustion. Not random digging. Searching. Remembering. Trent crouched beside her, following her nose, and felt the hard edge under the drift. Metal, cold through the glove. A hatch. The access door was half buried under ice and packed snow. Trent took a small pry bar from his pack, one of the few tools he'd brought because he'd learned never to rely on doors to open willingly. He chipped at the ice seam, breath steady, movements efficient. Jody held the carrier close, glancing toward the tree line with a doctor's eyes that had learned to read panic in muscles. Noah knelt near Trent's shoulder, phone light angled to catch the latch's outline. Vesper stood slightly ahead, ears rotating, nose tasting the wind, ready to intercept anything that moved. When Trent finally wedged the bar under the frozen lip and leaned, the hatch groaned like a living thing. It opened an inch, then two, then enough for cold, stale air to sigh out. Damp and metallic, a smell that carried oil and old concrete. Lara tried to go first. Trent caught himself reaching to stop her, then hesitated. She wasn't moving like a frightened animal. She was moving like a guide, like this was a route burned into her nerves. Vesper slipped in beside her, lowering his head to scent the darkness, then looked back at Trent with that silent certainty that always felt like a command. Trent went in after them, shoulders angled to fit, flashlight beam carving a narrow tunnel through the gloom. The concrete passage was low and cramped, damp with frost. The floor slick in places where meltwater had refrozen. The air pressed close, heavy and cold, and every sound, the scuff of boots, the soft pat of paws, seemed amplified by the walls. Vesper moved ahead, not rushing, scanning with his body, pausing at corners as if he'd been trained for it. Lyra followed, pausing occasionally to glance back toward the carrier outside, ears flicking in tiny, anxious motions. Trent had to remind himself she'd left her pups above ground, exposed, and every instinct in her wanted them back under her ribs. Jody stayed at the entrance with the pups, keeping them warm and away from the tunnel's damp air, while Noah followed Trent in far enough to document. "If we find anything, I need pictures before you touch it," Noah whispered, his voice swallowed by the tunnel's damp hush. Trent nodded without looking back. He'd learned that evidence had its own rules, and breaking them gave liars room to breathe. The tunnel ran 50 yards, then widened into a small utility chamber, where old pipes disappeared into the wall like veins. Rust streaked the concrete. A faint humming noise, probably wind finding a crack, made the place feel awake. Lara stopped and pressed her nose to a recessed square in the wall. Vesper sniffed the floor, then froze, head tilting slightly. Trent followed their focus and saw it. A small concrete niche, half hidden behind a dangling strip of torn plastic. Inside sat a hard case, black, watertight, the kind used for sensitive equipment. It was wedged in tight as if someone had shoved it there in a hurry and expected to return. Trent didn't touch it immediately. He turned to Noah. "Pictures," he said. Noah's hands were steady as he raised his phone, macro lens clipped on, light panel faintly illuminating the niche. He photographed the case from multiple angles, then the surrounding concrete, then the torn plastic. The case had a sticker, mostly peeled, showing the same faint bird emblem Trent had found on Lyra's torn webbing. A chill rolled through Trent that had nothing to do with temperature. Jody's voice drifted down the tunnel from the entrance, tight with urgency. "Trent, don't stay down there long. The pups!" Her words cut off as one puppy made a soft wheeze that spiked her attention. Trent hooked 2 fingers under the case's handle and eased it out. It was heavier than it looked. The latch clicked when he opened it, the sound too loud in the tunnel. Inside were paper folders sealed in plastic sleeves, a compact ledger, a handful of printed photographs, and a laminated sheet with codes. No sleek flash drive, no sci-fi implant records, just the oldest and most dangerous kind of evidence. Documentation. Noah exhaled sharply, almost a laugh without humor. "They still write it down," he murmured. Because paper doesn't get hacked. It gets burned. Trent flipped through the first sleeve. The pages were filled with shipment entries. Dates, times, route references, fuel depot codes. There were photos of containers on flatbeds, snowmobiles lined up in a row, and a grainy image of a fenced clearing in the forest where crates were stacked like coffin shapes. One page carried a header in block letters. Project Starling. Under it, the bird emblem. Trent's jaw clenched. The name sounded harmless, like nature. That was always the trick. Noah leaned in, pointing at a line of text. "Look at this," he whispered. "Batch token distribution. Split verification." He turned to the next page. "Maternal route lead. Trained." His finger tapped the paper. "That's Lyra." He said it like a fact, not a guess. Trent looked at the mother dog in the dim light. Lyra stood rigid, ears twitching, eyes darting between the tunnel's darkness and the route behind them. She wasn't just a victim. She had been used as a map that walked. Trent's throat went dry. He thought about the microdots on the puppy's ears, tiny marks that could hide in fur, invisible until violet light revealed them. Marks meant for a handler, for a receiver, for a buyer, not for a veterinarian, not for a sheriff doing community safety. That realization pressed against something old in Trent, the memory of being treated like a tool, evaluated, contained, moved. He'd come to the forest to stop feeling like that. Now the forest was showing him the same cruelty, wearing a different mask. As Trent stared at the ledger, Vesper suddenly stiffened and turned his head toward the tunnel behind them. His ears snapped forward, and his body lowered a fraction, silent, controlled. Lyra's hackles rose, a low vibration rumbling in her chest that wasn't a growl yet but could become one. Trent killed the flashlight and listened. At first, there was only the tunnel's damp breathing. Then came a sound that didn't belong here. A soft, rhythmic scrape, like rubber against ice. Not footsteps, not a voice, something gliding. Snowmobile idling? No, too muffled. The scrape repeated, closer, then paused. Trent's pulse hammered. Someone was moving above them on the logging road, and the vibration traveled down through the concrete, like a whisper. Vesper looked back at Trent, eyes hard and focused, then did something unexpected. He turned away from the tunnel exit and nudged Trent's knee toward a narrow side recess Trent hadn't noticed, a gap behind a pipe where the concrete wall had been cut for old wiring. It was barely wide enough for a man to press into. Vesper wasn't reacting like a dog afraid of noise. He was reacting like a dog who had learned the difference between random movement and a search pattern. Trent felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. This wasn't luck. Someone was sweeping the area, calm and methodical, and the tunnel that had hidden evidence could also become a trap. Trent forced his breathing down. He stuffed the most crucial sleeves and the ledger into Noah's bag, kept the laminated code sheet in his own pocket, and snapped the case shut. Noah's face had gone pale under his stubble, but his eyes were steady. "We have enough?" he whispered. Trent nodded once. "Enough to matter." He didn't say the other thing. That enough to matter also meant enough to get them killed. They moved quickly. Trent signaled Noah back toward the entrance, keeping his steps light, using the damp tunnel walls as cover. Vesper stayed between them and the sound, body angled to intercept. Lyra followed reluctantly, glancing back toward the chamber, as if she could feel her history still sitting there, exposed. When they reached the hatch, Jody was already braced, cheeks flushed, the pups bundled and warm against her chest. "They're okay," she whispered, eyes flicking to Trent's face. "But we need air and distance." Trent didn't argue. He shoved the hatch open, cold daylight slicing down like a blade. Above ground, snow had thickened again, the whiteout turning the forest into a blur of shapes. Trent's ears strained for engines, for voices, for anything. He heard only wind. That didn't comfort him. It meant the searchers could be close enough to see without being heard. They moved fast, dragging the snowmobiles into position and starting engines only when they were ready to leave, keeping noise minimal. Trent took the lead again, Vesper running alongside until he jumped aboard, steady and alert. Lyra stayed close to Jody's sled, eyes fixed on the carrier, as if the pups were the only compass that mattered. Noah hunched forward behind Trent, bag tight to his chest, the evidence pressing into him like a new burden he hadn't asked for but couldn't abandon now that he'd touched it. They didn't head straight for town. Trent took a zigzag route through cuts and narrow spurs, avoiding the main logging road where anyone could set a clean block. Twice he thought he saw movement through the snow curtain, dark silhouettes that could have been trees or men. Vesper's ears tracked each flicker, and the dog's body tightened every time the air shifted. Reading scents, Trent could not. By midday, the forest opened into a small clearing where an old Forest Service outpost stood, half buried in snow, its radio mast still visible like a thin finger pointing at the sky. The building looked abandoned in the way old government buildings sometimes looked, still functional if you knew the tricks, still holding power in their bones. A vehicle sat nearby, its tracks fresh. A woman stepped out from the porch with a calm, grounded presence that didn't need volume. Ranger Supervisor Maren Stokes was in her mid-50s, face weathered by wind and responsibility, skin ruddy, eyes steady and unblinking. Her hair, dark with gray threaded through, was cut short and tucked under a beanie. She wore a thick olive ranger jacket with a small patch, dark waterproof pants, and snow boots that had seen hard miles. A VHF radio was clipped at her shoulder, and she carried herself like someone used to making decisions when nobody thanked her. She took in Trent's uniform, the dog's, Jody's tense grip on the carrier, Noah's bulging bag, and she didn't ask for a story first. She asked for the thing that mattered. "Do you have injuries?" she said, voice firm, practical. Jody answered, "Minor. The pups are fragile." Maren nodded once and stepped aside. "Inside now." Trent handed over the case on the desk under fluorescent light that made everything look harsher. Maren opened it with careful hands, scanning the header, the codes, the photographs. Her expression didn't dramatize, but her jaw tightened. "Starling," she read aloud once, then looked up. "This is trafficking." Noah swallowed. "Yes." Maren reached for a form and started writing, pen scratching with decisive speed. She documented who, when, where, and what, building a chain of custody like a wall. Then she keyed her radio, voice clipped, professional, and requested Forest Service law enforcement support and state police coordination. She also pulled a small satellite communicator from a drawer and sent a short burst message, just enough to get the evidence out of the county's reach. Trent watched her and felt something unexpected loosen in his chest. A flicker of faith that procedure could sometimes protect the innocent instead of crushing them. They were still inside when the faint hum reached them through the walls, snowmobile engines, distant but real, looping somewhere beyond the tree line. Maren's eyes lifted. She didn't look afraid. She looked annoyed, like winter itself had become inconvenient. "They followed you," she said flat. Trent's voice was low. They were already sweeping. Maren didn't ask how he knew. She simply snapped her radio mic closer to her mouth. "Stay inside," she ordered. Then she looked at Trent, at Vesper, at Lyra, and at the carrier where two small lives breathed quietly. "You did the right thing bringing this here," she said, "but right doesn't always end quiet." When they left the outpost minutes later, moving fast because staying still made them easy, the sound of a snowmobile circled behind the trees, closer now, as if testing distance. Trent's shoulders squared, Vesper's ears locked forward. Lyra pressed closer to the pups. Noah tightened his grip on the bag. Jody's eyes flicked to Marin, searching for reassurance. Marin gave none. She gave something better, direction. And as they pushed into the snow again, Trent understood the new truth of this forest. Someone had turned it into a pipeline. Now it was becoming a battlefield, whether he wanted it or not. The forest did not get darker as the day wore on. It got brighter. Brighter in that cruel northern way where snow becomes a mirror and every living thing becomes a silhouette. Wind pushed powder across the logging cuts in thin shifting sheets, turning the world into a moving white wall. Whiteout wasn't just weather out here. It was cover. It was camouflage. It was an excuse for the kind of men who preferred their violence quiet. Trent Hargrove felt that truth in his bones as soon as they left the Forest Service outpost. The radio calls Marin Stokes had made were real, documented, official, but official help had distance to travel, and distance was a luxury he didn't have. His jaw stayed tight, his cold blue-gray eyes scanning the tree line, every muscle in his disciplined frame wired to the same goal. Get Lyra and the pups to the handoff point alive. Keep Vesper capable. Keep Jody and Noah breathing, and don't turn this into a firefight that would make the wrong people heroes. Jody rode behind him now, her smaller snowmobile coughing and catching in the deeper drifts. The carrier with the 2 pups strapped to her sled with layered insulation and a heat pack she'd warmed at the outpost. She had the posture of a woman who was tired and terrified and refusing to let either thing show. Dark scrubs under her heavy jacket. Cheeks chapped, eyes sharp with the calm urgency of someone trained to prioritize life over fear. Noah kept close behind on Trent's sled, holding his messenger bag with both hands, as if the evidence inside might spill out and vanish like breath. His glasses fogged, then cleared, then fogged again. He kept wiping them with an edge of his sleeve, a small, human ritual that made him feel less helpless. Lyra ran when she could, the gaunt Belgian Malinois mother, moving with stubborn determination, despite how her ribs showed under the damp fawn coat. When the snow deepened, she leapt onto Jody's rear platform without prompting, positioning herself so her body shielded the carrier from wind. Vesper remained the constant, full-grown male Belgian Malinois, lean and muscular, black facial mask stark against white glare, ears upright like antennae, dark amber eyes always forward, always reading. He ran, jumped, braced, shifted, never wasting a movement, never doing anything that wasn't about protection or positioning. The first snowmobile engine they heard did not roar. It hummed, distant and steady, like something trying not to be noticed. Trent lifted a hand signal to Jody without turning his head, a small, flat palm that meant stay tight, stay ready. Vesper's ears rotated to the left. Then another hum came, from the right. Trent's throat went dry. They weren't being chased from behind in a straight line. They were being shepherded, pressured into lanes. He remembered Marin's face at the outpost, the way her jaw had tightened when the first distant engine circled, the way she'd said right, doesn't always end quiet. She'd given him a meeting point, an old timber staging yard a few miles away, where clearing opened enough for a helicopter to land if it had to. "Hold that grid," she'd ordered through the radio, voice clipped steady. "If you can't, keep moving, but keep the carrier intact." Trent had heard the subtext. If you lose the pups, you lose the case, and if you lose the case, you lose the only thing that turns this from rumor into prosecution. They took a narrow spur that wound between dense pines, branches heavy with snow. Visibility dropped to a handful of yards. The world shrank. Trent leaned into the trail, letting the snowmobile's engine pull them through the corridor. He could feel Vesper's weight shift behind him as the dog adjusted balance like an extension of the machine. Then the corridor opened, suddenly, brutally, onto a wide logging cut, a flat, open strip of packed snow, with no cover, no trees close enough to hide behind, and the sky pressing down like a blank sheet. It was the kind of place people died when they didn't control timing. Trent hated it immediately. He didn't have a choice. They were halfway across the open cut when the first dart hissed past. Not loud. A soft puff, then a faint whisper in the air, then a tiny impact into snow. Trent's body reacted with a sharp lurch to the left. He didn't need to see the shooter to know where it came from. He watched the wind, the drift patterns, the angle of the snow spray. Vesper barked once, a single, hard alarm, and surged forward on the sled platform, body angling like a shield against an invisible line. Another dart hissed. This one struck the snow near Jody's sled, close enough that she flinched, and the machine fishtailed for half a second. Lyra sprang onto the carrier's side, pressing her body against it, ears pinned, eyes wild but controlled. She didn't run. She didn't panic. She became a wall. Trent felt a spike of respect that hit him like pain. He swerved again, cutting a shallow zigzag to break any predictable line. He didn't push speed recklessly. Speed on packed snow meant sliding into helplessness. He pushed enough to keep momentum and keep options. In the periphery he saw them. 2 snowmobiles parallel to the cut. Riders low and steady, wearing white-gray shell outerwear that blended into the storm. Faces hidden behind goggles and gaiters. No logos, no patches. Quiet, professional. One rider lifted an arm and fired again. Trent dropped low and felt the dart pass over his shoulder. He couldn't afford to let any of them hit Jody or Noah. A sedative in the wrong place would end this without a gunshot. He angled toward a low ridge of drifted snow that might provide half cover. Vesper shifted position again, planting his paws and leaning into the wind like he was reading trajectories. The dog's movements weren't magical. They were tactical, always placing himself where the threat line would intersect the most vulnerable thing. The most vulnerable thing was not Trent. It was the carrier. It was the pups. It was Lyra's exhausted body already spending its last reserves. Trent's lungs burned as he forced his mind to stay cold. He couldn't fight the hunters. He could outmaneuver them long enough for the real world to arrive. The hunters changed tactics. A third snowmobile cut across ahead, trying to block. Trent yanked the handlebars, turning sharply, skidding just enough to throw snow into the air and break the shooter's visual. Jody followed, slower, sled wobbling under the extra weight. Noah leaned hard with Trent, eyes wide behind fogged glasses, lips pressed together like he was holding back a scream. The wind howled suddenly, thickening into a true whiteout burst that swallowed the far side of the cut. The hunters used it. They moved closer in that veil, their engine hums shifting positions like sharks in fog. Through the white blur, Trent caught sight of something that didn't belong, fresh red staining the snow in a thin line, not from a wound but from a marker flare. For a second his mind tried to dismiss it as a trick of light. Then he realized the flare line formed a crude arrow shape, pointing toward a narrow break in the ridge. A trap lane. A corridor they wanted him to enter. Before Trent could react, Vesper suddenly jumped off the sled into the whiteout, disappeared for 2 heartbeats, and then reappeared at an angle, running hard with his head low. He wasn't chasing, he was pulling. His body language screamed one message: not that way. Trent followed Vesper's line and saw why. The snow ahead was subtly darker, smoother, packed differently, like someone had been there recently. It wasn't ice. It was netting buried under powder, stretched across the lane like a hidden snare for a snowmobile track. If Trent entered that corridor, his sled would catch, flip, and the carrier would become a gift. Vesper had read the ground the way some men read maps. Trent's chest tightened with something close to awe, and something else that hurt deeper. The dog was saving them, not by fighting but by seeing. Trent trusted him without hesitation, yanked the sled away from the flare-marked lane, and cut toward the ridge edge, where snow was rougher, less controlled, more honest. For the first time in hours, Trent felt a sliver of something he hadn't allowed himself in years. Belief that maybe he wasn't alone in his choices. They punched through the ridge edge into uneven terrain, sleds bucking over hidden ruts. Darts kept coming, but the angles were worse now, shots less clean. The hunters didn't like chaos. Chaos made their quiet procedures messy. Trent led them into mess anyway. He aimed for a stand of young pines where trunks were close enough to break line of sight. Jody's sled clipped a buried branch and lurched. She caught it, teeth clenched, and kept going. Lyra stayed pressed to the carrier, panting, eyes locked forward, refusing to be separated from her pups. Marin's voice crackled through Trent's handheld radio, clipped and urgent. "Hargrove, status." Trent didn't waste words. "Under pursuit, darts, nets. Open cut, just crossed. Need that timber yard grid now." Static, then Marin again, steadier than the storm. "Units are en route. Keep the carrier intact. Timber staging yard is your best chance for air support." 2 miles. Trent looked at the trees, the whiteout, the shifting hums behind them. 2 miles. Might as well be forever. He didn't tell Marin that. He said only, "Copy," and kept moving. They hit another open strip, smaller than the first but still exposed. This time the hunters tried a different tool. A cast net launched low and wide. It flew like a shadow against snow and landed near Jody's sled, catching the rear track enough to drag. Jody swore, fighting the handlebars. The sled slowed. Trent's stomach dropped. Vesper leapt off Trent's sled and slammed into the net line, teeth flashing, not biting a person, biting the problem. He ripped and tugged, muscles straining. Trent swung his sled around, using the machine's weight to pull tension off the net as Vesper tore at it. Another hunter closed in, reaching to grab the carrier strap. In that moment, Lyra did what mothers do when the world tries to take what is theirs. She launched. Not far, not reckless, just enough to snap her jaws at the reaching hand and force it back. Her movement was all ferocity and desperation, a thin body suddenly heavy with purpose. The hunter recoiled, startled by the fact that the cargo had teeth. Trent jumped off his sled and yanked Jody's sled forward by the rear grab bar, shoulder screaming as he hauled. He slipped, went down hard, and felt pain flare along his shoulder and collarbone as he skidded over packed snow. The world narrowed to a burst of white and the sound of his own breath. For half a second he tasted that old helplessness again. Then Vesper hit the approaching hunter like a battering ram, shoulder to thigh, knocking him off balance. The hunter fell, net line loosening. Trent used the moment to stand, grit his teeth, and shove Jody's sled free. Jody didn't stop. She gunned the engine and pulled away, carrier intact. Noah shouted something. Trent didn't catch the words, but the tone carried panic and gratitude tangled together. They ran the last stretch like ghosts, fast, silent, weaving through trees, pushing machines past what felt safe. The timber staging yard appeared through the whiteout like a blunt scar in the forest. A wide clearing with stacked logs half buried under snow. Old tire ruts frozen in place, a place built for industry now abandoned to winter. Trent killed his engine at the edge and listened. For the first time in minutes, the hunter hums faded, distant, circling. They didn't rush in. They waited. That waiting told Trent everything. The hunters knew the clearing was a checkpoint. They expected Law to arrive. They wanted to use Law as their final net. Jody pulled the carrier close, kneeling to check the pups. Their little bodies rose and fell. One pup let out a tiny sound that might have been a whimper or a breath. Lyra pressed her nose to the carrier seam, then sat, exhausted, shaking but still upright. Noah staggered off the sled, hands trembling as he clutched the bag with evidence. He looked at Trent, face pale, stubble stark, eyes wide behind fogged lenses. "We're not built for this," he whispered. Trent's voice stayed low and flat. "We don't have to be built. We just have to last." In the distance, a rotor thump started. Faint at first, then steadier. Or maybe it was tracked vehicles, hard to tell in whiteout. Hope sounded like machinery out here. Marin's voice crackled again. "Hold position. Do not engage." Trent almost laughed. "Do not engage," as if choice existed. Then Sheriff Nolan Braddock arrived. His patrol vehicle appeared at the far edge of the clearing, tires biting into snow, lights flashing a calm, official blue that made everything feel suddenly staged. He stepped out in his beige-brown uniform, boots polished, face composed, that practiced community smile in place, as if he'd arrived at a fundraiser. Behind him, 2 deputies fanned out, hands near belts, eyes scanning. Braddock raised a hand in a gesture that looked friendly from a distance, and controlling up close. "Trent," he called, voice carrying across the snow. "We got reports of an aggressive K9 and unregistered animals. Let's do this the easy way. Hand over the dogs. We'll ensure proper care." Vesper stood at Trent's side, body angled forward, ears up, eyes locked on the sheriff. Lyra rose with a tremor and positioned herself between the carrier and the deputies. Black mask severe, breath steaming. Jody's hands tightened around the carrier straps until her knuckles whitened. Noah swallowed hard. Trent felt the air go still inside his chest. The hunt had shifted. Snowmobiles and darts were one kind of threat. A badge was another, and Braddock, standing there like a gate, was about to close it. Sheriff Nolan Braddock stood at the far edge of the timber staging yard like he belonged to the landscape. The snow made everything look clean, and he used that cleanliness the way he used his badge, like proof that he was the only safe option. His beige-brown uniform looked almost warm against the white, his boots polished, his duty belt arranged with deliberate neatness. Even his smile was arranged, the kind you'd see in a small-town newspaper, beside headlines about charity drives and missing cats. But his eyes stayed pale and cold, scanning for weakness, measuring distance to the carrier strapped to Jody's sled, as if it were a piece of equipment he was entitled to reclaim. 2 deputies fanned out behind him, younger men with stiff shoulders and a cautious hunger to do what authority asked. They kept their hands close to their belts, watching Trent, watching Vesper, watching Lyra, each of them deciding which story they wanted to be true. Trent Hargrove felt the weight of every gaze like a physical thing. His shoulder still burned from the fall on the open cut, a deep ache that reminded him he wasn't invincible, not even close. He stood upright anyway, because his body only knew 2 ways to exist in danger: collapse or control. He chose control. The green digital camouflage of his uniform looked wrong here in the snow, but it was the only skin he allowed himself. Vesper stood at his side, full-grown male Belgian Malinois, lean muscles tight under deep fawn to mahogany fur, black facial mask sharp as a warning sign. Upright ears, intense dark amber eyes, steady, obedient, mission-ready, facing the same direction as Trent. Lyra hovered near Jody's carrier, gaunt but unbroken, her own black mask severe, her body angled to protect the 2 puppies bundled inside. The pups were quiet now, breaths small but present, the sound of survival tucked under layers of cloth. Noah stood a step behind Trent with his messenger bag gripped hard against his chest, knuckles white. His glasses had fogged and cleared so many times they carried smudges like bruises. He kept blinking, trying to stay calm, trying not to fall apart in front of men with badges. Jody kept both hands on the carrier straps, her jaw set, eyes dark and steady. Doctor's fear turned into doctor's stubbornness. Braddock raised his voice just enough to carry. "Trent!" he called as if they'd been friends once. "We've got reports of an aggressive K9 and unregistered animals. For the safety of the community, I need you to hand them over." He lifted a clipboard that looked official from a distance, but could have been blank paper for all the truth it held. "We'll ensure proper care. Doc can keep her eyes on them if she wants." His tone stayed smooth, polite, the way a man speaks when he expects compliance. Trent didn't answer immediately. He forced his breath, slow. He felt the old urge to explode, to turn this into a confrontation where his anger could do the talking. Anger was easy. Anger made you feel powerful even when you weren't. But this wasn't about power. It was about staying alive long enough for the right hands to take over. Trent's gaze flicked to the tree line, scanning for movement. The hunters were out there somewhere. Astra Shield's quiet retrieval crew, waiting for Law to do the dirty work. They didn't need to fire a dart if a sheriff could sign a form. Jody spoke first, voice calm but tight. "Sheriff, these animals are under medical observation. I have documentation." She didn't wave it like a weapon. She held it close, like proof that truth still mattered. Braddock smiled at her as if she were a child trying to stop a storm with an umbrella. "Doc, I respect you," he said, "but you know protocols. Unregistered animals can't be transported like this. And that dog," he nodded toward Vesper, "is trained. He could hurt someone." Vesper didn't move. He simply watched, steady, a living contradiction to Braddock's narrative. Static crackled from Trent's handheld radio at his hip. He didn't reach for it yet. He didn't want Braddock to see hope coming. He wanted the sheriff to commit. Let him place his hands on the lie. Braddock took a step closer, boots crunching softly. "Hand them over," he said again, voice lowering, losing some of the public friendliness. "This can be simple." One deputy shifted, eyes flicking toward the carrier straps like he'd been told exactly what to grab first. Lyra's body stiffened. Her breath came out in a low, steady huff that wasn't a balk but was close. Jody tightened her grip. Noah swallowed, Adam's apple bobbing, and whispered, "Trent," as if he didn't know what he was asking for, but knew it couldn't be surrender. Vesper suddenly sat, not out of obedience to the sheriff, not out of fatigue, out of control. He sat perfectly straight, eyes locked on Braddock, ears forward, body still as stone. Then he did something that made Trent's chest tighten in a way that hurt. Vesper lowered his head and pressed his muzzle gently against Trent's gloved hand. A brief, grounding touch, like a silent promise. Trent felt the warmth of the dog's breath through fabric, felt the steadiness there, and for a heartbeat his mind flashed to every moment he'd been the one held together by someone else's will. He realized Vesper wasn't just guarding the pups. He was guarding Trent's decision, the line between turning violent and staying smart. Trent's hand closed briefly on Vesper's neck, not gripping, just acknowledging. In that tiny contact, Trent heard something that wasn't a voice, but felt like one. "You don't have to become what they expect." The thought landed like a weight and a mercy at the same time. He lifted his chin, and when he spoke, his voice was calm enough to be dangerous. "You're not taking them," Trent said. Braddock's smile thinned. "You want to make this hard." Before Trent could answer, a low thump rolled through the air. Rotor wash, distant but growing. The snow in the clearing trembled slightly, a subtle vibration that made everyone's posture shift. Braddock's eyes flicked upward, then back to Trent as if he could will the sky quiet. Trent reached for the radio now and clicked it on. Marin Stokes' voice came through, clipped, firm, the voice of a woman who didn't waste words on fear. "Hold position, units arriving. Do not release animals to local custody." Trent let the transmission hang in the air like a verdict. Braddock's face changed, not dramatically, just enough. His smile stayed, but his eyes went harder, more exposed. "Marin!" he called toward the tree line. as if she were a person he could argue with instead of a force. "This is my jurisdiction." A line of vehicles appeared through the snow curtain, dark shapes cutting into the clearing with purpose. First came 2 snowcats with Forest Service markings, then a pair of state police SUVs, tires biting deep, lights flashing blue and red against the white. Men and women in winter gear moved out with practiced coordination. One wore a Forest Service law enforcement patch, stance wide and steady, gloved hands visible and calm. Another, a state trooper with a square jaw and a thick winter coat, approached with a clipboard that looked real, in the way Braddock's didn't. Paperwork backed by teeth. They didn't shout. They didn't posture. They simply placed themselves between Braddock and the carrier, with the quiet certainty of authority that didn't need to prove itself. Marin Stokes stepped into the clearing last, moving like she owned the space without needing to say so. She was bundled in an olive ranger jacket, her short dark hair threaded with gray tucked under a beanie, cheeks wind-burned, eyes steady. She held a satellite communicator in one hand and a file folder in the other. She didn't look at Braddock like he was a villain. She looked at him like a problem already documented. "Sheriff Nolan Braddock," she said, voice even. "Chain of custody has been established for evidence tied to illegal transport and unlawful sedation. You have been instructed not to interfere." Braddock lifted his hands slowly. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice smooth, trying to slip back into persuasion. "This man is unstable. He's carrying aggressive dogs. The Forest Service agent cut him off, tone flat. "Step back." Braddock's eyes darted, calculating. He glanced to his deputies. One looked uncertain now, the shine of certainty draining from his face as larger authority filled the clearing. The other still held stubborn loyalty, but his hands loosened near his belt as if he'd just realized he could be on the wrong side of the story. Noah stepped forward, voice shaking but clear enough to matter. "The microdots on the pup's ears," he said. "They match the split token format in the Starling ledger. The bird emblem." He reached into his coat and pulled the torn strip of webbing. "It's the same." Marin took it without touching Noah's fingers, eyes scanning. Jody added, "Medical documentation supports restraint injuries and exposure consistent with transport. Rope burn on the mother, injection scar, sedative scent on retrieval darts." She didn't accuse Braddock directly. She didn't need to. She let the facts do the cutting. A state trooper opened the watertight case and began reading entries aloud. Dates, route references, fuel depot codes, matching them against a printed dispatch list. Another officer stepped to a portable device and confirmed snowmobile rental logs, tied to a fuel shed outside town. Pieces clicked into place with a quiet inevitability. Astra Shield's retrieval crew, still hidden in the trees, lost their cover the moment the clearing became a perimeter. Forest Service units spread out, radios murmuring, eyes scanning the tree line. Snowmobiles in the distance turned away, engines suddenly less bold. Braddock tried once more, voice lowering, menace slipping through. "You think you're saving them," he said to Trent, lips barely moving. "You think this ends here?" Trent met his gaze with the calm, composed authority he'd worn like armor since the day he stopped feeling safe in his own skin. "It ends with them alive," he said. "That's enough." The Forest Service agent stepped closer to Braddock. "Sheriff Nolan Braddock, you are being detained pending investigation for obstruction and suspected facilitation of illegal wildlife transport and controlled substance misuse." The words were procedural, but they landed like a door slamming shut. Braddock's smile finally cracked, his jaw clenched, nostrils flaring, and for a second the man beneath the uniform surfaced, angry, cornered, afraid. Then he was handcuffed, the metal bright against his sleeves, and the clearing exhaled a collective breath it hadn't realized it was holding. Lyra trembled, then slowly lowered her head to the carrier. One puppy made a tiny sound, and she pressed her nose to the seam, as if counting their breaths with her own. Vesper remained at Trent's side, still angled protectively, shoulder wound visible, but no longer bleeding. His dark amber eyes softened, just slightly, the way they did when the immediate danger passed, but the vigilance never left. Trent felt his own muscles loosen for the first time in days, and the sudden release made him almost dizzy. Jody knelt beside the carrier, checking the pups, then looked up at Trent with wet-eyed exhaustion. "They're going to make it," she said quietly. Noah sat down hard on a log stack, shoulders shaking as he finally let himself feel what he'd been holding back. Later, when the evidence was boxed and sealed and the officers had moved Braddock and his deputies into vehicles, Marin approached Trent. Snow clung to her jacket and beanie, but her eyes were clear. "You can leave now," she said, "if that was your plan." Trent stared at the white forest, the stacked logs, the churned snow where a badge had just lost its power. He thought of the duffel he'd packed in the cabin, the old habit of disappearing before anyone could ask him to stay. He looked down at Vesper, then at Lyra, who had finally curled around her pups in a corner of the state police warming tent, eyes half closed, trusting the heat without surrendering awareness. Trent realized something simple and brutal. The forest had already chosen for him. Not with destiny or poetry, but with need. 2 puppies needed warmth. A mother needed safety. A partner needed a human who wouldn't run when things got hard. And Trent, whether he admitted it or not, needed something to protect that wasn't tied to orders and ghosts. "I'm staying," Trent said. The words surprised him with how steady they sounded. Marin nodded once, like she'd expected it. "Then we build something that lasts," she replied. In the weeks that followed, the forest became quieter in a new way. Not the dangerous quiet of being hunted, but the honest quiet of work. Trent, Jody, Noah, Cole Dunning, and Marin turned an unused ranger outbuilding near the outpost into a warm, functional shelter. No polished sign, no grand mission statement, just heat, clean bedding, medicine, and space for working dogs that had been discarded or abused. Cole brought spare heaters and fixed generators with hands that never stopped smelling faintly of oil. Noah set up secure records and backups like a man determined never to let evidence disappear again. Jody built a small clinic corner with supplies and routines, her calm competence turning chaos into care. Marin used her authority not as a weapon, but as a barrier against anyone who tried to turn dogs into property again. Vesper healed, the thin scar on his shoulder becoming another quiet mark of survival. Lyra slept deeply for the first time, her body finally loosening as the pups' breaths grew stronger and their eyes began to brighten. The pups started to toddle after Vesper, mimicking his angles, his pauses, his alert stillness, learning the language of protection without knowing the cost behind it. One evening, Trent stood outside the shelter as snow fell in slow flakes, softer now, the sky a pale wash above the pines. Vesper pressed against his leg, warm and solid. Lyra lay inside with the pups tucked into her belly fur, eyes half-lidded, but peaceful. Trent looked out into the forest and understood what home meant in a way he'd never allowed himself before. Home wasn't a place that erased the past. It was a place that gave you a reason to stop running from it. And if destiny existed at all, maybe it didn't fall from the sky. Maybe it arrived on 4 paws, knocked 3 times, and waited until you were brave enough to open the door. Sometimes the miracle doesn't arrive with thunder or a bright sign in the sky. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the middle of ordinary life, through a loyal animal's instincts and a tired person's decision to do the right thing one more time. If you believe in God, you know this truth. He often uses the smallest lives and the simplest moments to pull us back from the edge, to remind us that love is not weakness, and that courage is still possible, even when we feel empty. This story is a reminder that Faith is not just what we say on good days. Faith is what we do when no one is watching. It's choosing compassion when it would be easier to walk away. It's protecting the vulnerable when the world tries to label them as property or problem. And it's trusting that God can turn a cold, silent forest into a place of purpose, healing, and home. In your everyday life, you may not face a blizzard or a chase through the snow, but you will face moments that test your heart. A neighbor who needs help, a family member who needs patience, a stranger who needs kindness, an animal that needs shelter. When those moments come, remember this. God doesn't always remove the storm, but He can guide you through it. And sometimes He sends you a reason to stop running. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what part of the story stayed with you. And if you want more stories about loyalty, faith, and second chances, subscribe to K9 and Seal Stories and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. May God bless you and your family, protect you in every season, and fill your life with the kind of courage that shows up in quiet choices. Amen.